Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar from the IIM. My name is Charles Stuart. I'm the host for the day or the next hour or so. Basically, let me just introduce or let the panel introduce themselves briefly for you. Maybe start with Joe, across left to right.
Hi there, everyone. It looks like it will be quite a small group today, so hopefully you're all in a very questioning mood. So my name's Jo Menz. My background is corporate HR, and actually every time I look at these slides, I think I must update the slides for next time, because I've actually been an interim manager for over 15 years now. So I moved away from the corporate world, having worked in RBS in the great years and then the really not so great years, and swore never to be an employee again, and that's something that I've kept going. I now have a portfolio career, so I'm an executive coach, I do some consulting, and I still do some part-time interim or fractional, as we're starting to call it more and more.
Yes.
That's me.
Thank you.
Simon Hudson, co-founder at Morphosis Partners. Previous background as a headhunter, both introducing interim and permanently employed talent. And prior to that, I had a formative period working in, I suppose, traditional corporate across telco and financial services. And we've been supporting interims to get from A to B for a number of years now. That's it.
Thank you, Simon.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Simon. I'm Tony Evans. I happen to be the chair of the Institute. I've been in the interim profession now for considerably longer than the 20 years declared on this slide. So I too ought to update it. But suffice to say, I've been doing this long enough to have got the hang of it. I operate at CEO level or board advisory, that kind of thing. I also do chairman type work. And I end up getting involved where things are quite complicated and some form of transformation is required. And hopefully we can all add some value for you in the next hour.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Myself, just Charles Stewart, so an interim for just over 20 years, mainly in the supply chain space across lots of different industries, with probably the last 8-9 years focused in life sciences on transformational stuff. Been a member of the IIM almost since I started, been part of the board and currently the secretary for about the last 10 years or so. So that's the panel. Let's crack us on. So today's agenda, I'm not going to go through everything here, but you can have a quick read. You'll see the sorts of areas that we're going to talk through. We'll have Q&A later, so if you'd hold on to your sort of questions, or you can pop them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, which is not on my screen, so I can't point it to you. And then we'll have those at the latter stages of the session. This is being recorded. The recording will be shared with you afterwards. And you'll be able to sort of come back to any of the participants on the call for any questions that you subsequently think of. Okay. About the IIM, very briefly, Tony will talk much more later. So the Institute's been around nearly 25 years now. It's run by an executive board of, we like to call the word seasoned, I think that's a lovely phrase, seasoned interims on a voluntary basis. So it's run by interims for interims. And we work with a variety of collaborative groups, such as our partners, which Morphosis Partners is one, and a group of leading interim service providers that we have linked through our affiliate program. And that's basically the short intro to us now. So with one last thought, just to pose some questions for you. What brings you here today? A whole bunch of things on the screen. You are probably at a juncture of thinking about, do I want to become an interim? Do I want to get involved in this strange thing called interim? What is it? And we're here today to try and share some of our experiences and knowledge with you in that that will hopefully help you to make a decision. Jo, over to you.
Thanks, Charles. So as I mentioned in my intro, I've been doing interim work for the last 15 years. In 2018, for perhaps against my better judgment, I decided to do a master's in occupational psychology. And when I came to the dissertation, I decided I would look at interim management because it's a career choice that has really suited me. And I found a lot of people, both in my day-to-day work and also in my work as a coach, were saying, oh, actually, I quite fancy that. What's it about? What makes people good at it? And I was really surprised to find there actually wasn't very much research out there. And given the amount of money that the interim world contributes to the economy and the number of people who go down an interim route, I thought there was a real opportunity to find out a little bit more about why people do it, what makes them good at it, and what kind of behaviours and characteristics do those people who go down the interim route need in order to be a success. So you can see there on the screen the main objectives of my research. And what I really wanted to do was get to a point where I could make recommendations. So if somebody was considering an interim career, they could kind of have a look and think, yes, actually, that does sound like me, or perhaps, no, it doesn't, and make a bit more of an informed choice. As part of that research, I did 16 one-to-one interviews. So people who were experienced interims, the one with the least experience had 2.5 years. Some, including Tony, who I interviewed at the time, had 20 years experience. So on average, around 10 years experience, and really talking to them about how they'd found the interim world, what had led them to it, and what they believed the successful characteristics would be. And to supplement that and to meet the academic requirements, I read around, well, over 90 articles and the extracts from books. So I kind of think of this presentation as I've done that reading, so you don't have to. I've saved you that. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I looked at was when is the right time to move into interim management? And I think the first of these points is probably the most important one. And that's around, are you happy with the level that you've reached in your career? Interim management has a lot of advantages. What you don't get from interim management is traditional career progression in the same way that you would as an employee. So if you think you've got that next big role in you still, if you're still climbing that corporate ladder, then it's probably not the right time. Of everybody I interviewed, there was only one person who felt that he still wanted to progress in his career. And of all those interviews, he was the only one who was planning to move out of interim and back into the permanent world. He felt that he needed that badge almost. So I would say that that is absolutely the first thing to think of. The next point about career success is an interesting one. So people who thrive in an interim world aren't that worried about what other people think of them. Obviously, they want to do a good job. There's the contractual relationship. But in terms of kind of having that conversation with your friends at the weekend, or what do you do for work? They're people who actually don't really mind whether other people get it or not. And they have much more subjective measures of career success. So it's actually about doing work they enjoy and feeling that they're happy rather than having the job title, having the company car and that sort of thing. But the push or pull point was a really interesting one. I was interested in my research to find out whether there was a difference between people who'd actively chosen interim, like I had, or whether there are people who'd been sort of almost forced into it or fallen into it, perhaps because they'd been made redundant. And what was interesting is there was no difference at all. My sample of people I interviewed was completely random. It was actually about half and half between people who'd chosen it, people who'd fallen into it. And it showed that actually you can be a successful interim, whether it's something you've actively planned or whether it's something that's kind of just happened and then you've realised you've liked it. Tony, I don't know whether there's anything you wanted to add to any of those points before I move on.
I would reinforce all three of them. And I think when you've been made redundant, the last point, push or pull, it also, for most people, I think being made redundant, particularly if it's the first time, then it's a moment to be able to pause, metaphorically put your foot on the ball, and start directing your own traffic a bit. And so having that time to think about what it is you really want out of life, and is the greasy corporate pole for you. So I think that probably reinforces the point you're making. it just makes everybody have to make a conscious effort. And that's why I suspect we've got the people listening to us this morning, as it were. They're taking it seriously.
Thank you. So in terms of what you can expect from interim roles, there's probably not huge surprises on this slide, but these are the consistent themes that came up from the interviews that I had with everybody. I think variety and challenge were probably the two most commonly talked about areas. When you go in and out of different organisations, it's work that you've done before. People hire you as an interim because of your track record, not because of your potential. So that's a big difference from being hired into a permanent role. But you get variety. So even if the content of the work is the same, your stakeholders will change, the industry might change, the teams you're working with will change, and that brings a different sort of challenge to climbing the greasy pole, as Tony's just referred to it. Work-life balance and flexibility were an interesting one. I was certainly a little bit naive, perhaps, when I went into interim, because I thought, well, it's great. I'll just work for 9 months of the year and I'll take every summer off. Unfortunately, assignments don't quite work like that. And I'm sure Simon will go into a little bit more detail in his section. So you do get work-life balance, but it is this constant kind of worry about, well, actually, my assignment's finished. Do I take the risk of taking a little bit of time out? Or if the phone rings and I'm offered another assignment, should I go straight into it? So it's definitely there. It's definitely more balanced, I think, than your typical permanent role, but it's not quite the flexibility that you might hope for. The freedom from corporate politics and independence are also really, really important. When you're in an interim role, you don't get sucked in the same way, and actually you're good at what you do because you're detached from it. And that's certainly what I found. Once I stopped worrying about how I was going to be rated in my performance review, which might then impact on my bonus, I realized I was actually making decisions about my work based on what was actually right for the organization. And it's really important to sort of hold that as an interim and retain that independence. And
Can I make a comment on that?
of course, Tony.
This is not to say that you can ignore corporate politics.
No, that's very true.
Yeah, it's very important you're aware of it, because it's part of navigating to get to where you need your work to go. And so that level of awareness is good. The independence linked to that is part of this thing, where very often as an interim, you're in the position where you have to speak truth to power. You've got to tell them how it is, not wrap it all up in a nice, packaging with a bow round it.
Absolutely. No, thank you. That's a really good point. I think if you were to go into an organisation as an interim and not have any awareness or sensitivity to some of that corporate politics, you wouldn't be successful. But you're detached from it in that it affects you in a very different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
The last point on there is around less stress, and this was a common theme that came out of all of my interviews, is people working in interim roles generally found it less stressful than having a permanent role, because to a certain extent it's on your terms a lot more. It's kind of a purely contractual relationship. I will do the work, I will invoice you, you will pay me. So that sort of links to that whole politics and everything piece. But it is a different type of stress, because in a permanent role, you might go to work for an organisation and maybe you'll move around in one or two internal roles, but really you don't have to keep constantly going out and selling yourself and finding new work. As an interim, it's not uncommon to be doing that 2-3 times a year, more often if you're doing fractional work or shorter term assignments. So it is a different sort of stress, but overall that kind of work related stress did seem to be less in this population. And then in terms of skills and behaviours that you need to succeed, you might look at this and think, well, actually, you need all of those things in a permanent role. And I think to a certain extent, that's true. If we start with focus on results, which is right there in the middle and hitting the ground running, when you start a permanent role, people might think in terms of what's my 100-day plan. You don't have that luxury as an interim. If you're on a day rate, you have to be delivering from day one. It's not a matter of sort of days or even months or even weeks. It's days to prove that you've got that credibility, that you're able to deliver. You are likely to have to deal with a lot of ambiguity because you won't know the stakeholders, you won't know how things are done here. You'll have to work around that, all whilst actually proving that you can do the job and deliver. And that requires a certain amount of resilience and adaptability. You don't really know from one day to the next what's going to be thrown at you. The building rapport and credibility, again, things that you would absolutely need in a permanent role, but it's about being able to do it very quickly, and you're potentially going to feel like a bit of a threat to some of the people that you come in and work with. They will be doing the day job, and then suddenly somebody's parachuted in to do the sexy project that everyone wanted to work on, but nobody had time. And you've got to get those people on side and figure out how to work with them, and demonstrate to them that you can do it and that you're not a threat to their role. Actually, you're a very different beast. Probably the last thing you want is one of their permanent roles, but it can be quite a sort of delicate line to tread sometimes. I think the two on here, and we touched on it a little bit on the previous slide, that really separate out interims from permanent employees, are this piece around detachment and independence. You need to be able to remain slightly apart from the group. You're not going to be invited to the Christmas party. You're not going to be part of the in crowd. You are there to deliver a piece of work, not be one of the gang. Personally, I absolutely love that. I don't miss the enforced corporate fun of my corporate career at all. But if you are the sort of person that wants to be really in the thick of things, and knowing what's going on and having a finger in lots of different pies, then interim may not be the right sort of thing for you. Tony, anything you'd like to add on that one?
It's a good observation. I think it is. No, I don't want to add anything else. I think you have to. It's how you get that right in each assignment that helps determine how successful you'll be.
Absolutely. And as I'm talking, by the way, if anyone wants to pop any questions in the Q&A, we will obviously come on to answer those a bit later in the call. So far, I've very much talked about the upsides. Hopefully you can hear in my voice, I love interim work. I can't imagine being a permanent employee again. And there are certainly a lot of positives, and that came out from all of my interviews. However, there are some downsides as well. Next slide, please. I think the first one on there, availability of assignments, was certainly relevant when I did my research a few years ago. I think it's probably even more relevant now. It's a tough market. And there are two elements to this availability of assignments. There's obviously the financial side. You don't get a monthly salary when you're an interim. You will have your invoices paid while you're working, and when you're not working, no money comes in. So there's definitely the financial side, and it helps if you have some sort of buffer up front, so that you can ride out those peaks and troughs, particularly early in your interim career before you've built that up. But more than that, there's this whole kind of emotional standpoint about, are you the sort of person, if between assignments you're just going to sit looking at the phone thinking, crikey, nobody's wrong, I might never get an assignment again, and find that hugely stressful? Because if you can't handle that, then actually the interim world is probably going to be on balance more stressful for you than a permanent role. And it does get easier over time, definitely. That came out in the interviews I did with everyone. I remember somebody saying in one of the interviews, to start off with, that really worried me between assignments. Now I've been doing it for 10 years. Of course, I know the phone's going to ring again, but it does take a little while to get your head around it. And I suspect Simon might cover this in his section, but the market has not been fantastic recently. I think it is starting to pick back up again. But that bit around availability of work is really something to think about. So can you manage financially, and can you fill your time in a way between assignments where you're not just going to be really stressed out all the time? And location.
I would add the comment there, Joe. I would add
Yes.
the comment there that you can't afford to be passive and wait for the phone to ring. And I'm sure Simon will make the point quite forcibly. It's how you approach the market and promote yourself and position yourself and all that kind of thing.
Definitely. And part of that is around the location of assignments as well. So I've been very fortunate. I live just outside London, and the majority of my work has been within commuting distance of where I live. A lot of interims don't find that. They will travel, they might be away from home during the week or for long periods of time. So you can't assume that you will be working in the same place from 1 month to the next. So for some people that absolutely works, for others not so much. And again, it's something that you just need to factor into your decision making. And then in terms of the content of the work that you do, you might be brought in just to deliver a specific piece of a specific project. And that can be great if you just want to get stuck into that bit. You might find it frustrating if you get a project to a certain point, your assignment comes to an end, and then it's handed back to the BAU team to actually deliver. Again, it's about what's right for you and whether that's the way that you like to work. You don't always get full control, even within that chunk of a project. You might find that on some days you're doing really strategic work and you think, yes, this is absolutely why they've brought me in. They needed my experience, they need my insights, and you'll be there presenting something in a board meeting. And then the next day you might be stuffing envelopes for a redundancy exercise because there's actually nobody else around who's on the inside of the project, and you just have to get on with that. So it's about having that flexibility of not being too precious to roll your sleeves up when you need to, but being able to kind of take a strategic viewpoint and do the operational stuff and whatever's really needed at any time. And it's hard work. If you're paid a day rate, you are expected to actually provide value for money. So there's no kind of skating in at 9 and leaving at 5, or certainly not all day, every day on an assignment. And if you're there specifically to deliver a project and that project deadline is looming, as the interim, you're probably the one that's going to be really putting the hours in to make sure that happens, because your success is measured on the delivery of that project. Anything else that you wanted to add on that slide, Tony?
Just the reinforcement of it. And I think part of that is to remember that the success of that particular piece of work, that assignment, is the fuel for your CV and how you will promote yourself and position yourself as part of the next piece of work you're going to actively look and find.
Absolutely. I think that phrase, "you're only as good as your last assignment," really rings true.
Good idea.
Definitely. So the last thing that I looked at was in terms of how individuals sustain that interim career. What is it that makes people successful and be able to continue doing it? It's really important to keep your professional skills up to date. When you're an employee, you will find probably from time to time you get sent on a training course. There are opportunities at work to do online training, or you can put yourself forward for different things. If you're an interim, it's up to you to do that. And depending what your background is, that might be CPD, to make sure that you keep up with your financial background or your HR background. I'm not suggesting by any means that everyone has to go off and do a master's partway through their interim career. In fact, it's really hard work, and had COVID not happened, I might not have ever finished it. But you definitely need to keep your skills up to date and find a way to do that. Some of the interim search firms provide some training. It will be obviously relevant to the sector that you work in. And you will develop within your roles, but it's likely to be because you're learning about a different industry or a different group of stakeholders. Rather, you're not going to be sent on a training course by any of your clients. And networking is so important. In 15 years, I've been placed once by an interim search provider. Every other assignment I've done, or every piece of consultancy work I've done, has been through my network. Now, the word networking can sometimes put the fear of God into people. It doesn't mean you have to walk into a room of strangers and just stroll up to somebody and start talking to them. It might be, and it's much more likely to be, reaching out to previous colleagues, going to targeted events, and perhaps finding out in advance 1 or 2 people who might be there that it would be worth grabbing a coffee with. And also find a handful of interim search firms where you develop really good relationships, and don't just ring them when you need an assignment. Keep in touch with them. And I know Simon will talk about this a little bit more as well. Just really important to let people know that this is the way you're now working. Keep those relationships going, because the chances are that the bulk of your work is going to come from people you know, rather than from, in inverted commas, advertised roles. And my last point on there is really around mindset. If you think back to some of the sort of behaviours and characteristics that we talked through that were really important to being an interim, to a certain extent, you can learn most of those things. But I do think there's a real point here about you can learn the technical skills, you can learn the behavioral skills, but actually it's about your mindset. Are you the sort of person who wants that flexibility, the variety, the challenge, the risk of it? And if you are, do you know what? You'll probably make it work. That's everything from me. I think that's my final slide. And again, please pop any questions in the Q&A and we'll come back to those at a later point in the session.
Lovely. Thank you for that, Jo. Hello, everybody. And great to see that everybody's still on the webinar, which is great. So clearly there were just the right balance of positives in there, which is great. And actually, for a fair proportion of the interim profession, you know, it does work pretty much as they had intended. So I think the annual survey that the IIM does would probably highlight that, you know, typically when that's done, somewhere between 40 and 50% are off assignment, 50 to 60% on assignment, and each year that will shift in terms of who is and who isn't. So, you know, clearly it's a profession that offers success and flexibility for the vast majority. So what are the core tricks, tools, traits, methods that will help you to ensure success? The first observation, to reiterate Jo's point, is that, you know, interim is about transitioning based on a level of aptitude and capability, competence that you've accrued, which you are essentially wanting to take forward and deliver more so on your terms. The trade-off is a variety of businesses can get to benefit from that acquired expertise. So to Jo's point, it's not about potential. You've got to really be able to recognise what have you done in your career, what are you really good at, where's the impact come from, and is that an impact that is specific to one former employer, or is it something that can be delivered as value that can be replicated to others? And if it's the latter, then interim is highly likely to be a good path for you. And again, particularly if you're looking at routes to market, which I'll mention in the next slide, but essentially your routes to market are going to be through former colleagues, acquaintances in your network. It could also be the recruitment part for interims, which are referred to as interim service providers. Now, if you're going to choose that channel and you're just starting out as an interim, you've got to understand that the ISP is trying to effectively sell a commodity, i.e. proven capabilities that can be delivered, high impact, short time frame. And so often for a lot of ISPs, they may find it more difficult to help you land that first interim opportunity than if you were, for example, to look at your existing network. And we'll go on to the ways and means of doing that on the next slide. But just bear in mind that what you're trying to package is something that looks like value and deliverable. And then again, picking up on Jo's earlier point, you know, winning assignments, unlike winning a permanent job, is something that realistically you're going to have to deal with on a much more regular basis. Existing network contacts as advocates clearly help with that. The right ISPs can clearly help with that. But ultimately, there are more than just the one or two routes or channels to assignment opportunities. And those who are more successful more often are the ones either by fluke or by proactive action have more of the channels working in a coherent manner. So next slide, please, Charles. So if we were just to plot the path to sustainable success, where do you sort of go as you transition from your permanent career? The first thing is to understand that as a permanent career, your perception, your brand could be, wow, they're a great CFO. They were 10 years in that last business leading finance, and they were 18 years previous learning the tools of the finance trade. It's a slightly different perception because unfortunately that doesn't say you could go into a business within 30 days, you know, bite the bullet, get a quick win, get a feather in the cap, and then you can sort of continue to deliver, I don't know, the next 6 to 12 months or whatever that interim assignment opportunity is. So perception is quite important. What do we mean by that? If you're looking to venture into the world of interim, does your current branding, positioning, message, does it look like a permanent employee? So are you talking 10 years here, 15 years there? Or does, for example, your LinkedIn profile break down your periods of employment into series of projects, case studies, and similar, which have a narrative that would imply speed, haste, deliverable? And secondly, with that, to what extent are you able to separate your value contribution, i.e. what I did, versus within an employee group, what we did? And I think that's another distinction that you need to consider when you're formulating your message. So the written message could be a CV, it could be a LinkedIn profile. As a lot of interims do over time, it may even be a very basic website where you would simply highlight past case studies plus contact details. So essentially, your shop windows often become more broadly used as well. I mean, a number of interims I know, they're quite busy doing round tables and speaker events. Perhaps those things never really presented during their permanent career. So being comfortable with being more visible around your proposition is something else that I would say. The second element is comfort. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you've got a message that says, for example, you are, I don't know, a great interim HR person like Joe, and your capabilities around, I don't know, talent attraction strategy, workforce, whatever it may be, ultimately, it's all very well having that on a CV or on a LinkedIn profile, but at some point you're going to have to engage an audience. So by comfort, we mean the way that you actually interact. So this is to do with potentially the recruiters. This could be with presenting back to former colleagues and contacts in your network. So, for example, somebody that's known you as being that loyal corporate entity for 15 years as a good ally to each other, the story now or the narrative now needs to be, well, that was me then, this is me now, and actually take them on that journey to accept what your new proposition is. Because gaining their acceptance will make life as an interim so much easier in terms of advocacy. And part of what we do with certain clients, we sometimes take references up to support the positioning. And there was one chap that was looking to go interim quite recently where I spoke to one of his best friends who he's played golf with for about 10 or 12 years. So you'd argue they know each other very well. And I just said, this guy's looking to move forward as an interim. Is he? I didn't know that. He just never had the conversation with him. So no, you do realise he's currently looking for new assignment opportunities. Is he? He doesn't give me that impression. He's always so confident. So I think the whole positioning thing is, again, don't make an assumption that just because this may be what you want and what your intention is, that everybody has the crystal ball to be able to recognise and interpret that. So it is about offering comfort, and that means being authentic, being consistent, be yourself. And the good news is it's not about selling ice to Eskimos. At the end of the day, this is about people will buy you, and it's the firmness of your handshake and the conviction of your tone that will land you the work. Trust, or comfort as we call it. And then we get the reality check. So for people looking to break into interim or people that may be mid-career with interim, you've also got to be aware of things like market rate. What is your skill set worth as a day rate to a particular community of potential employers? Because if, for example, you've worked in, I don't know, let's say the lucrative side of financial services for a number of years, and you now want to reinvent as an interim, and let's say that the audience is not for profit, you're not going to get your £2,000 a day type interim gigs in that environment. Try as you might, or if anybody does, I'd love to know about it. The reality is, though, is each section, each, I suppose, capability has a perception of value on it. So make sure when you're coming to market that you ask the ISPs, you look at the annual IIM survey to get a sense of, for my skill set, my capability, what does the market value look like for that? And if that number looks relatively right sized for what you need, then again, you're not going to get far wrong. But there are certainly cases that we've seen where people have great competence and capability, they engage really well, and it falls at the final hurdle because there's a misalignment between what that capability is worth and what the end audience is prepared to put on it in terms of day rate and value. Next slide, please. So the routes to opportunities. Interesting to hear from Joe that The vast majority of those opportunities came through existing network, former colleagues and similar. I'm not actually surprised by that, but it's great to hear. But it's not exclusive to that. If you're just starting out, existing network would be the channel that I would recommend the most. For the individuals that we've supported and the data we track, for people starting out as interim, existing network accounts for more than 2/3 of their first client wins. So certainly if you're starting out, I would recommend you have a look at your existing network, look at former colleagues. In fact, you could do a little survey with them. Pick out the core 20 or 30 people that you think they know me, I know them, they're a good test benchmark for you, and simply have the conversation with them. If I was to venture out as an interim offering X, Y, and Z, is that something that your business would be drawn to? Would you have any attraction in that? Is it something that your business would entertain? And then, of course, if it's a no, well, if not you, then who? So it can play the ripple effect. But the existing network is really, really valuable, particularly for people following out. It also impacts with the ISP community, because if you look to approach the internet server, interim, I'm saying internet as well, Joe, there we go. It's the ripple effect. But with interim, I will get it right, interim service providers, one of the things that they will do when you first look to register with them is ask you not just for a CV and an example of case studies or projects that you've delivered, but they will often say at the front end, can I take a couple of references? So getting the existing network on side before you look to do that is actually quite a smart move, because what you don't want is those existing network contacts to say to an interim recruiter, yeah, this person's great. Yeah, if you've got a year to do something, they're great. So they may say it with the best of intentions, but actually it can actually unseat the opportunity in terms of that first impression. So getting the right people in your existing network on side is definitely the advice I would give. For people who've got 1 or 2 interim assignments already in the bag, then ISPs are certainly at that point going to be much more interested in you. Why? Because you look like you are proven, you've earned the badge. So for them, it becomes much of a more marketable proposition for them. A couple of things I will also say there with the ISPs is that, again, the annual IIM survey, basically from interims, they are all basically saying who have they used, who's good, who's indifferent, etc., etc. All of that becomes a very, very useful resource if you're starting out, because the key skill there is to assign yourself to the right consultant in the right firm, which may seem very obvious, but actually what happens over time is a lot of professionals just accrue more and more contacts. They don't then take the time necessarily to audit them, and they could find themselves naively chasing contacts in the network who are no longer relevant. So make sure that you maintain that flow of understanding, because people do move around, particularly within the recruitment sector. 2 other things there that are worth saying to you. Competitor marketplace, what do we mean by that? It's probably no surprise that if you've got a bit of a reputation, let's say doing, I don't know, finance in retail, that it's more likely to be a retail customer that an ISP is handling, or from within your existing network, that is most likely to recognize the comfort and the value of your placeability. So if you've done great stuff at Aldi, great stuff at Lidl, probably no surprise that Waitrose will want to talk to you. So think about that when you're trying to determine what is my landscape for opportunities. But the one that most often gets omitted from people's strategy, I suppose, is what we would call situational alignment. And certainly where we see a lot of success for people is when they recognize that they're not, for example, a CFO for retail. It goes one step beyond. It's, I've been a CFO for retail predominantly, but actually I've noticed that the last 3 or 4 roles have been private equity backed businesses, or I seem to go in just at the point that they've gone through a lot of merger and acquisition activity, and I now seem to be being brought in to help with integration or things like that. So the situational piece as a trigger is arguably the most attractive carrot when you are networking. And the number of times we've seen people who have knocked on a door and said things like, I can see that your business has I don't know, undertaken a series of M&As over the last 12 years. It's something that catches my eye because I'm 20 years within the M&A space myself, and I thought there'd be an opportunity to connect. And they just pose a cryptic question, which is fairly logical, which is, you know, some organisations acquire lots of businesses and keep them in a holding pattern for a number of years. Others are quite keen to integrate and get the synergies of scale in the back office. Just out of curiosity, where are you? It's an easy way of getting work, or at least having the conversation start. Beyond that, you've then obviously got to be the person that's right size for their definition of whatever the solution is, or you could be a cog of many cogs. So the situational piece is great because if you subscribe to things like City IIM, which gives you a daily easy digest to what's going on in businesses, or if you're not so London centric, you could have things like the Business Desk, which does regional plugs on what's going on in Yorkshire and the Northwest. It's great. It's just sound bites of business, and it's all trigger points. They're either announcing profits or they're announcing lack of, generally speaking. And depending on where you are within your capability, so are you the HR person who's great at Chupi? Are you great at organizational design? You can actually track businesses so easily from that clue towards your skill sets. And then it's not that your luck factor increases, but when you knock on that door, you're much more likely to get really good timing. Can I ask what your current situation is? So bear that in mind. And this is something that you at an individual level can do. Technology, as much as it frustrates me, and I'm sure plenty of others, it makes life so much easier than it ever used to be. I mean, imagine trying to connect to people without LinkedIn before LinkedIn became a thing. There's now 1 billion people on there that you can literally say hello to, should they be relevant to you. And then the ripple effect actually is if you're coming from a large corporate and that's typically been your background of experience, you tend to find that, so there was one guy that we were aware of about 4 or 5 years ago, and he's done 3 interim gigs now over about 3.5 years, but within the same business. He went in to sort out a cog in one division of a business, built his network internally, effectively create the ripple effect. And then he was basically asked, well, could you do the same over in this division? And he's now got the same. At some point, those divisions will probably think, can we have a layer above now that sort of ties them all together? Whether that will have his name on it or not, who knows? But the point is, particularly for people with larger corporate experience, it's worth asking the question, you know, how does this project in this business impact more widely and more broadly across the other areas of the business group? And again, if you start asking those types of questions, it's not that you can uncover secret jobs or hidden jobs. We don't believe in that. But what you can do is create conversations around an area where you have expertise and capability. And then that enthusiasm, that expertise will show. And then hopefully it becomes a conversation where you would turn around to that person and say, well, look, you seem quite engaged by this, you seem receptive to this. So how do we make it happen? You know, how can we deliver this value into your business? What would that need to look like? Essentially, when can I start? You know, so all of these routes give you a much broader view than what Joe sort of alluded to, which is the negative side, where you may be off an assignment and you're sat there thinking, right, I need my next assignment. What do I do? Most people spend far too much time on LinkedIn, and they spend far too much time on the door of least resistance of these 5, which unfortunately in this list will be the ISPs. And the problem is ISPs, yes, they need talent, yes, they need a steady flow, but generally speaking, they're looking for somebody who has been placed by somebody else before, they've broken the duck essentially, and then they become a more marketable sort of resource for them. And it's not untypical with ISPs for them to have their favoured few that they will go back to time and time again, because what an ISP is looking for is, and it may seem a little bit frustrating as an interim, because a lot of ISPs, and again, I wasn't an ISP, but I used to place interim and permanent people. So I kind of know some of the mindset here, which is, if you're putting forward a shortlist of proven talent, you want to put forward talent that can win at a selection process. Because until that person wins the selection process, the ISP is not getting paid. So unfortunately, you've also got to recognize that with an ISP, their job is a sales job. matching talent to opportunity in exchange for whatever their margin is with their terms of business. So when they're looking at who that individual is, yes, they're looking at skill set, they're looking at compatibility to the brief, but they're also gauging chemistry of you to their intended client, decision maker, but also your ability to really blow them away and land that opportunity for them, which then obviously helps their reputation when they go and look for their next assignment, because an ISP's reputation is as good as the quality of the interims that they place. So hopefully that makes sense. And I think that's my bit done, isn't it? Apart from a summary. So in summary, focus on what you're really good at and package it up. That's your most valuable asset. One of the benefits of being able to do that, though, is that the more in tune you are with your key capabilities and competence, the more finite your audience becomes. So, quick example, a CEO interim that we worked with a while ago, he was struggling to get traction, nearly 12 months off assignment. First conversation I had with him is, how do you position yourself to market? And he said, well, I'm an interim CEO, or maybe an MD, got a background in finance, I could be open to that. Right, that doesn't sound like conviction of leadership. So have the fit. And as soon as the fit was done, his audience became finite. He approached 10 companies and was given 2 offers. So the better your focus, the more in tune you can be about who your target audience is. And also, when you focus on your strengths, you don't have to sell yourself half as hard, because you can be your authentic self. You're effectively saying to people, for this, I back myself. It's actually quite easy to say. And ultimately, you're just going to, you're just going to be utilized far more, and you will be successful as a result. So there we go. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Tony, over to you for a little bit, and then we'll stop sharing and go to Q&A.
Do the unmute thing. Before I go on, just poke people on the call. So if you've got questions now, things that you want to know, which may or may not have been covered so far, then please do feel free. In terms of my bit here, I'm really going to try and explain to you why you should consider, as part of taking up an interim career, joining the Institute. Okay, Charles mentioned earlier that we are, in fact, all practicing interims ourselves, and so the Institute is run by interims for interims. So we have a clear understanding of the needs of interims at all stages in their career. So from yourselves, and I'm making the assumption that you're here on this webinar today because you're contemplating a career in interim management, rather than you've been doing this for some time and you'd like to do some revision. So there are certain things which the Institute can provide and do for you to help you down that path. And I think you've got some glimpses of that today. Simon, who represents Morphosis Partners, are one of our partners, which help with the element of how to go to market and help guide you through that win. One of the points he was making earlier is that the ISPs are there to satisfy client wants and needs, hopefully needs rather than wants. The best ones manage to get the client to a need rather than mucking about with a want. But it's not the only thing. In terms of the Institute, we can help with a number of aspects, which you'll see on the list on the right there. A key thing is that you need to be able to build your credibility in the marketplace. Now, when you obtain work through an ISP, all the ISPs will sell what they deliver to the end client, which includes, we reference all our candidates. All our candidates are, bona fide, wonderful deliverers kind of approach, which is fine. But given that at least initially 2/3 of your market likelihood is going to be your own network, you need to be able to say, you can trust me to do this kind of stuff. I'm a professional interim. I've been set up to do this. And part of that is that you apply to join the Institute. and we reference you. So you will have independent accreditation as an associate or a member of the institute, depending upon your level of experience in the world of interim. Okay, there's a list of things here that you would need to undertake to the bread and butter of setting yourself up in business. Some of this is more complicated these days because if you happen to be working in and around the public sector or large tranches of the financial services sector, an awful lot of end clients are interested in you working, doing things called inside IR35 contracts, which means that you would effectively end up on a payroll rather than working through your own limited company or similar. So that could influence the way that you start, but that's easily dealt with depending on which sector you're actually in. Charles, if you'd like to ping it on one, thank you. The Institute itself, as Charles mentioned, has been around a while now. It goes back to 2001. The key things that we do are indicated there. The benefits to the individual interim, I think, ought to be understood. And it will depend entirely on your own situation, which of these things at any given moment in time on your way through your interim career are the most important. So there's no one fixed view that says the Institute is good for people, for everybody in this way, but certainly at the beginning, and my assumption is that's where we are currently with you all, is the independent accreditation is a very good start, and we act as a very good signpost at the beginning to help you into the industry. The membership has been £160 a year for some considerable time now. So before we have any bright ideas like increasing it, you might want to think about applying for membership. There's an initial £40 application fee, and for those who are on this particular webinar, Charles will no doubt produce a waiving figure so that because you've attended the webinar and you can show that, the £40 might be not required to be paid. And the connection points are there for you if you want to follow up with the Institute to get any more information before you start. The website is full of information if you're prepared to invest a little bit of time going and exploring it as well. We've tried to make the application process, which is online, as simple as possible. So it shouldn't be too onerous to work your way through it. You basically need to supply CV. You need to be able to give us a couple of referee contact points so we can identify the things we need to do to assess the application. And you need to be able to demonstrate that you're setting yourself up and in business on your own account. Okay, so have I got another slide in there, Charles? Yes, thank you very much indeed for your attention. And I'm hoping that when I go to the Q&A now, there'll be a few questions where people have got some bits of information that they're burning to ask any of us here, but principally I suspect Simon and Joe, because they've talked the most in terms of usable or potentially usable information. Charles, are you gonna run through the Q's and A's now to keep us out of mischief for a few minutes?
No, that's fine. So we've got about 5 minutes. So right, earlier one from Odette. Thank you, Joe. Really useful. One question: where can you find a list of relevant events to consider attending?
I wish it were as simple as there being a list. I think there's probably a few different places you can look depending on your profession. So my background's HR. So the CIPD, which is the HR professional body, runs a certain amount of events. So I will be going to CIPD live this year, not because I'm a buyer of any of the services, but because I know there will be people there who might be a buyer of me as a service. So I shall go there and target a few people in advance, meet them for coffee. The ISPs also run events. Some of those can be hugely useful in terms of network. Sometimes there'll be events aimed at interims and you'll find yourself in a room with effectively a whole bunch of your competitors. So useful to talk to people and find out how they're finding the market and how they find work. But I would say some don't necessarily go to ISP events with an assumption that you will meet potential clients. You're more likely to meet more people like you. And then I think just think a bit more broadly, and again, just keep up with your network about things that are going on. So recently I went to an event for people considering going on the Cranfield non-executive director course. I'm not actually considering going on that course at the moment myself, might be something I do in the future, but I knew that it would be a room full of senior people currently in permanent roles who may at some point need either some consultancy or an interim HR director or an executive coach. So again, useful to go. So I think creatively, lean on your network, look to your professional body would be probably my 3 bits of advice.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. James has got one. This is such great and helpful content. Thanks. My question is it seen as negative on an interim CV if there is time off assignment? I think, Simon, this is a very much a you one.
Thank you very much. I like the easy questions. Well, if you're trading as an interim, the first piece of advice is that you will be set up to trade as something. So Hudson, interim, whatever it may be. And so from that point of view, as far as LinkedIn is concerned, that will show from when it was established to present. That's the first thing that you can have. At some point, you're going to get into the conversation where somebody will say to you, okay, and when were you on last assignment? What did you do? When did that end? So at some point, the gap will suddenly present. But if you can defer and forestall it until you've had the opportunity to get in conversation to establish a bit of rapport and chemistry with somebody, then I think it becomes easy then for the onward positioning. So that is the general view I would give. Is it a negative? I think if it gets beyond a certain time frame and you don't have a reasonable story to tell that is genuine for the extending gap. I mean, for example, if you say, well, I've been off 15 months because I was just sat there waiting for the phone to ring and I was quite lackadaisical with it, then of course that's not going to have the same impact as if you say, well, actually, after 20 years continuous corporate experience, quite frankly, I think I earned a bit of a breather. I was paid for a year anyway because of my non-compete severance clause. So I took a year off to work out what I wanted to do. And this is what I've done in the intervening period. So it then becomes acceptable, is the advice. So it's the narrative, but as far as LinkedIn and your CV is concerned, put your trading as business on there. It's a great way of moving you at least into conversation before you then offer the narrative.
I would also add the point that an interim CV is quite different to a permanent role CV. So you that's part of the learning process on how you position and promote yourself.
Yeah,
I don't use dates.
Thank you. Now we're up at time. We've actually got 2 questions. If we want to answer those quickly, we could take those.
Let's do it. Let's do them, Charles. Let's do them. Come on.
So one from Matthew. Do you have any guidance around marketing oneself as having a preference in relation to taking interim roles that are within or outside of IR35?
I'm happy to leap straight onto my IR35 soapbox. One way of doing it, which I know wouldn't work for everyone, is I've just refused outright to do any inside IR35 roles. And my rationale for that is I genuinely run a business. I have 3 separate income streams. And for me to be effectively treated as an employee without employee benefits for one of those income streams just makes no sense. The flip side of that is I've lost out on assignments because of it, because despite the theory that there are no blanket bans of outside IR35, it does effectively happen. And I think the more you can demonstrate to an organisation that you are there to deliver a specific piece of work as a service, the more likely you are to be able to market yourself outside IR35. But certain roles come up that will be a fixed term contract or an inside IR35 role. And depending how established your interim career is, and depending whether you're as high on your soapbox as I am about the matter, actually, it might suit you to take an inside role.
And I would also add that there are certain sectors, like the public sector, where the norm is inside IR35, because they're all pretty much having to toe the HMRC party line. Nobody wants to upset HMRC and all that kind of thing. So it's not so straightforward in some areas. But if you understand what your day rate is, if you were doing the traditional normal interim outside IR35 charging a day rate, and then you've got some understanding of your tax situation, you can rule of thumb it to say, well, that's the equivalent of this. If I was to get the money I would have got from an outside IR35 day rate, I need to charge this amount as the fixed term contract or monthly salaried thing on an inside IR35 PAYE basis.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, yeah, no, Odette's adding extra ones. Anyway, let's deal with the first one. Tony, what do you mean by the IIM reference members, and can you elaborate on how they would support in the job search?
Okay, there are two things in response to that. Firstly, when you apply for membership to the Institute, we ask you to provide us with the contact details for 2 referees that you would supply, which supports your application. So we would look at what those referees would say about you and compare and contrast them with what you're indicating on your own CV. And we will check to ensure that what you're saying is what they perceive as having been done. So that we can see that we've got the same person, if you like. That consistency is important to us. For somebody with no current interim experience, all we're looking for is, in terms of your permanent employment track record, is it something that can be reinforced by the referee? And secondly, if you've got some form of interim track record going in there, that it's been as successful as the picture you're painting on the CV. So we expect people to be able to paint something which is very positive, but we expect it to be also realistic. So if you went in and made £1 million worth of savings, it's £1 million worth claimed. The client can recognise this, and it's not 10 million on the CV, and the client saying, "Whoa, hang on a minute, no, it was £1 million," kind of thing. So that we've actually got that sense of realism about the whole thing. The other point I would make is, as an interim, you don't go for a job. You need to understand there is a change in language here that's important, and it's part of the transactional analysis and the psychology of moving from being a servant of a company in a contract of service to a contract for service where you're a supplier, and it's a peer-to-peer relationship, not a parent-child. It's very important to understand that distinction.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. So we'll wrap up with the last one, unless Odette
Another last one.
Another last one. Does inside IR35 or not matter when you are establishing as an interim? I'm quite sure there's a quick answer to that one.
Who wants to say yes?
I was going to say no, not really. It's about establishing your portfolio credibility, I suppose. And if you're going to go back to your existing network, they're less likely, I would say, to do it outside. But you don't know. You don't know, is the point. So I think if you go to market saying on your branding only outside or only inside, to me, it's about optimizing or maximizing the opportunities for conversation that you can get from an audience. And once you then determine what the parameters of the need is, and they've bought into you emotively, psychologically, and in terms of capability and competence, then you're in a far stronger position to determine the nature of which they secure that expertise. So generally, that's what I'd recommend.
And it's a fair point for people starting out. I think the application of the tax filter will be as a result of whoever you're talking to at the time and how they see the individual piece of work, the assignment. So it's something you need to be aware of, and you certainly don't want to be upsetting HMRC, but there are things that you need to understand and go through if, as and when you get to that point, like status determination tests and so forth, which all good end clients will make sure are in place.
Okay.
That's for another day. I think it's a layer in the onion a bit further.
It is, yeah. All right. So thank you very much. And there's definitely no more last questions, so we'll wrap it up. So just remains for me to thank Joe and Simon and Tony, and to each of you who've joined today. Small but good question, small group but good questions. So thank you. The recording will be made available to you afterwards in a few days, and also contact details for those on the call as well, should you want to follow up with any particular questions. Hopefully you found it useful, and I just want to reiterate, there is in the deck you will see when you on the recording, so there is a waiver on the £40 fee for those of you who might want to join quickly. That's already in place for those of you on this call, so you'll see that in the recording, and I'll put it in the subsequent email as well. So hopefully you found it useful. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you again, Simon, Joe and Tony. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks very much
everybody.
indeed, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.